Hi everybody. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Wesley Hollenberg, and this is a deck profile for Team Top Cut Comics. This is my deck from the Madison Regional Championships. As you can see, it is a Buzzwole Garbodor variant. It's a relatively unique list, as I'll explain. I'm going to go through my card counts, my matchups, and then some just general thoughts on the deck moving forward, including potential changes I could see making. So let's get right into it. First off, your main attacker in the deck is going to be Buzzwole GX. It's got 3 huge attacks. It's really one of the strongest cards in standard format. It's just got some incredible things it can do. First off, it has Jet Punch, which does 30 damage to the active and then 30 to 1 to your opponent's bench Pokemon. It's extremely important in the early game. You can kind of set up knockouts for it later in the game, or you can take knockouts on the smaller HP basic Pokemon that would normally evolve into bigger Pokemon. Your second attack and third attack are Knuckle Impact and Absorption GX. Both of them are your harder hitting attacks. Those are the kind of attacks that you aim to start hitting in the mid or late game and really help kind of take those big prize knockouts on opposing GXs. It's a pretty basic card, Buzzwole, but it's an extremely strong card and has a lot of functions that allow the deck to really work. Next up, you have the Baby Buzzwole. This is your other attacking Pokemon in the deck, and you use it to force your opponent into an odd prize game. It's a non-GX attacker, so it allows your opponent to only take 1 prize when they're knocked out. And it's extremely strong when your opponent's at 4 prize cards, as it has the Sledgehammer attack, which does 120 damage for 1 energy. Huge fan of the card. It was very helpful for me, especially in matchups against decks like Zoroark, where I'm able to one-hit KO Zoroarks with Sledgehammer when they're at 4 prize cards. So onto the support Pokemon, we have 2 Tapu Lele GX. It's just here usually for its ability of Wonder Tag to help search out supporters in the early game, and then Energy Drive can sometimes get you some average damage to set up 2-hit knockouts potentially. Finally, we have 2 Trubbish and 2 Garbodor. Garbodor is really important right now for the Garbotoxin ability. It's kind of what makes this deck as strong as it is. It's really important to slow down all of your opponent's decks, and as I'll talk about, it makes a lot of the cards in your opponent's decks pretty dead. Against the most popular deck, Buzzwole Lycanroc, they ran a lot of Pokemon that have abilities. They run Lycanroc, Diancie Prism Star, Regirock, Octillery, and Tapu Lele, and a lot of those cards are cards that are just there in the deck for their strong abilities. So by having this Garbotoxin, you're able to make your opponent's Buzzwole Lycanroc deck have a lot of cards in their deck that are just dead weight. So not only does it kind of make your opponent's deck weaker, but in terms of their cards not doing anything, but it also gives them cards in their hands that they're going to draw that do absolutely nothing and kind of clog up their hands, as opposed to being useful as they would be in most games. Now, that's kind of it for the Pokemon. Garbodor is really what allows this deck to function, because you're able to use the large strength that Buzzwole has in terms of just being such a strong card in Standard right now, while also being able to shut down a lot of opposing Buzzwole decks and Malamar decks and Zoroark decks, because a lot of Standard right now is very predicated on having strong abilities in your decks. Now onto the items. We are running 4 of the Beast Rings. It's the big new card from Forbidden Light, and it allows you to search up energies and attach them to your Ultra Beasts when your opponent has 3 or 4 remaining prize cards. It's really important to load up Buzzwole GX to set up those Knuckle Impacts and Absorption GX attacks, and that's why you run 4 of them. It is your engine for this deck to load up your attackers, so you want to run the max count to get it out as much as you possibly can on that big turn where you can play the Beast Rings. Usually, from what I found in testing, you want to play about 2 Beast Rings a game, and if you do, you win almost every time. When you play 1, things get a little more dicey, but usually you still win because of the other tricks in your deck like Garbotoxin and, as I'll talk about later, Fighting Fury Belt. So Beast Rings just kind of really important for loading up your Pokemon and setting up for the later stages of the game. Now next up we have the search cards. We have 3 Mysterious Treasure and 4 Nest Ball. As I'm sure you've noticed, there's a large omission. I am not running Ultra Ball in this deck, and that is because in testing what I found was that discarding 2 cards from your hand was just too steep a cost to pay. Usually in this deck, I just didn't have the cards in my hand to be able to discard to play things like Ultra Ball. And while Ultra Ball is very useful, cards like Nest Ball and Mysterious Treasure are able to give me that kind of same amount of search power, with Nest Ball just getting me a basic, which can get me almost every card in my deck. The only things I can't search out very well are my Garbodors, and I can't search out Tapu Lele to use its Wonder Tag ability. And that is exactly where Mysterious Treasure steps in. What Mysterious Treasure does is you can search your deck for a Psychic or Dragon Pokemon if you discard a card from your hand. And while it still has that discarding effect, which is similar to Ultra Ball, you are discarding 1 last card, which is actually a really big deal for this deck, because almost every card in the deck is a resource you'd like to kind of keep and use when you're ready to use it. So as such, you really want to be careful with your resources, so you run the Mysterious Treasures because they let you discard less cards than Ultra Ball would. Next up, we have Order Pads, and these cards are really important for just kind of boosting your overall consistency. As you've kind of noticed, this deck is very much a B-string focused deck where you're trying to get the B-strings out as much as you can. When you have that big turn, you want to make sure you're playing those 1 or 2 B-strings every game. You never want to be caught in a situation where you don't have the chance to play B-string. So as such, you're running Order Pads, which increase both your odds of playing B-string, but they also help you set up your deck up. As I'll talk about, you can search out tools with it, and also you can search out in the early game, your Nest Balls and your Mysterious Treasures. It kind of allows you to increase your odds of setting up the Buzzwoles and the Garbodor and getting those out as quickly as possible. Next up, we have Random Receiver, and this card is actually in as a byproduct of the fact that I run Order Pad in this deck. Now, normally I would Order Pad for Mysterious Treasure for a Tapu Lele and use that Tapu Lele to pick my supporter, but in this deck, because you're running Garbotoxin, you don't always have that luxury. So instead, what I often do is when I've got Garbotoxin active, I will Order Pad for Random Receiver. And Random Receiver, while it doesn't guarantee me the supporter I want, it allows me to get a random supporter, hence the name Random Receiver, from the top of my deck, and that is always better than having no supporter in my hand. So it's just another card that kind of allows me to boost the consistency because this is a Garbodor deck, and Garbodor decks are usually less consistent unless you run cards to make up for it. The beauty of this list is that I have the space to make up for it because the deck is just so focused on just running Buzzwole, unlike a lot of the other Garbodor decks where you're also running the Trash Launch Garbodor and a slew of attackers. Now next up in terms of items, we've got 4 Floatstones and 4 Fighting Fury Belts. Floatstone is pretty self-explanatory. It is your tool of choice on Garbodor, and that is just to retreat for free. You want to make sure you don't get caught in the active with a 3 retreat cost, so you're running Floatstones. And other than the Floatstones, we're running Fighting Fury Belts, and that's kind of the big card that allows this deck to have a favorable Buzzwole-like interact matchup. Now, normally Buzzwole only has 190 HP, which is pretty easy for opposing Buzzwole to knock out. They just need a choice band, and that's 190, but because I run Fighting Fury Belt in this deck, my opponent needs to do 230, which requires them to have a choice band and then 2 other ways to boost 20 damage. Now, normally it's pretty easy for them to get to 230 because they can put a strong energy down and then have a Diancie Prism Star on their board. So, normally Fighting Fury Belt wouldn't be that strong, but because this deck also runs the Garbotoxin, you force your opponent to have, in order to one-shot a Buzzwole, they need a strong energy, another strong energy, and a choice band in order to one-shot with Knuckle Impact. And to find half of a deck's strong energy is really hard to do, especially because I have the Garbotoxin out that is slowing down my opponent's ability to draw cards and kind of get through the deck to find what they want. So as such, Fighting Fury Belt really makes it very difficult for opposing Buzzwoles to knock you out, and it also has this nifty plus 10 damage, which allows the Knuckle Impact attack on Buzzwole to do 170, which is really big when you combine it with strong energy. You're able to do 190, which is exactly enough to knock out opposing Buzzwoles. And because they themselves don't run Fighting Fury Belt, I don't have to worry about having to do that extra damage that they have to worry about against me. So this deck is kind of tailor-made to have a favorable Buzzwole-like interact matchup because you have the Garbotoxin that turns off all their abilities. As I mentioned, they run a lot of cards that have abilities. You've got the B-Strings, which is actually a 4 count, which is higher than them. And you've got Order Pads to search out the B-Strings. So you've got kind of an extra level of consistency in terms of finding your B-Strings. And you've got Fighting Fury Belt, which gives your Buzzwoles a longer lifespan. And even when they don't have a longer lifespan, it requires your opponent to play more cards to knock them out. It requires them to waste more resources on taking a single knockout as opposed to having to only play down like a choice band to knock you out. They need to also find their damage boosting energies, which can be a struggle for them at times. Now onto the supporters, which are kind of just more basic, but they also have a story to themselves because I'm sure, as many of you have noticed, almost every deck in Standard right now runs Professor Sycamore because it is just such a strong supporter. To discard your hand and draw 7 is always a strong effect, but in this deck, as I mentioned, with the lack of Ultra Ball, you don't really have the space to discard those cards. In the early game, you never want to see yourself discarding B-String. You never want to discard your Guzmas, and you especially don't want to discard extra energies because this deck runs a bit of a lower energy count than the Buzzwole-like interact decks. So instead, I make up for it with a extra large number of shuffle draw or just general draw supporters that are not named Professor Sycamore. So in this deck, I am running 4 Cynthias, which is just a pretty basic shuffle draw 6. 4 Ns, which are especially strong in this deck because in combination with Garbotoxin, it's very easy to stick your opponent with low hand sizes. And when your opponent's got a low hand size, it's very difficult for them to kind of find what they need, especially given that their cards like Zoroark and Artillery don't work anymore, and as such they really need to draw exactly what they need to get out of it, which can at times get you some pretty easy wins and pull off some crazy comebacks. Next up we have Lily, which is really your turn 1 supporter of choice. What it does is if it's your first turn, you can draw cards so you have 8 cards in your hand. And the reason I run this is because you don't really want to waste a Cynthia or an N on your first turn if you don't have to. Those cards, you want to always have access to them when you want them, especially N. In the later stages of the game, you always want to make sure you're able to give your opponent a lower hand size and challenge them to find a way to knock out like a 230 HP Buzzwole that's taking one-shots. And usually they can't. But you're only able to create that situation by maintaining the N's in your deck, and as such you run cards like Lily to kind of fill that spot where maybe I would have to play an N if I was not already playing Lily. Next up we have Hala, and this card needs a little bit of explanation. What it does is you shuffle your hand into your deck, and if you have used your GX attack, you draw 7 cards, and if you have not, you draw 4. And the idea here is that in comparison to Professor Sycamore, you are shuffling your hand into your deck, and very often I would rather shuffle my hand in my deck and draw 4 than maybe discarding like a beast ring on my first turn or discarding an energy on my first turn with Professor Sycamore. And because this deck runs such a high supporter count compared to many other decks in Standard right now, you're able to usually have another supporter in your hand, so you're not usually forced into playing the Hala on the first turn. But the beauty of it is that in the later stages of the game, it can double as an extra Cynthia, because once you've used your GX attack, you draw the 7 cards, and it just becomes very strong. So it's almost like an opposite of Lily, where in the early game, Lily is extremely strong, but it gets weaker as the game goes on, while Hala is relatively weak in the early turns of the game, but gets very strong as soon as you've used your GX attack. Now finally, we have 4 Guzmas. These are pretty self-explanatory. You want to always be able to switch out. Let's say you use Knuckle Impact, and you want to reset that, or you've got a Garbodor with a Fighting Fury Belt on it because you needed the Garbotoxin, and that ends up getting stuck in the active position. Now, it's also always important to bring up opponents' Pokemon. It's really big for closing out games or getting pretty easy knockouts with Jet Punch in the early game, so as such, I run a max count of that. Finally, in terms of the list, we run 12 basic energies. Now, of course, we run the 4 Strongs and the 1 Beast. Those are really important for boosting your damage. I talked about how it's really important to get to that 190 mark, so you run 5 different cards that, in conjunction with Fighting Fury Belt, are able to allow your Buzzwole to hit 190 damage and one-shot opposing Buzzwoles. And in terms of the basic energies, those are on the lower side compared to most other Buzzwole decks right now. Most Buzzwole Lycanroc decks are running 9 to 10 basic energies, but this list only runs 7. And a large reason for that is that I actually choose to forego Max Elixir. And part of that is just because I felt like I didn't have space, but the other part of it is that I feel like Max Elixir kind of lowers your overall consistency of a deck. Very often, decks like that become very reliant on hitting those Max Elixirs, or if they're not hitting Max Elixirs, finding their Beast Rings at the right time. So I decided that I would rather just play a deck where I always have access to the Beast Rings. The Beast Rings are extremely consistent. When I play it, I'm always getting the 2 basic energies. I'm always setting out my Buzzwole for the later stages of the game, and it's really difficult for my opponent because I'm always doing that. Every game, without failure, I'm going to likely be playing a Beast Ring. And it's just so much more consistent in my experience to have those the max kind of Beast Rings in the order pads, as opposed to trying to cram in Max Elixirs and more energies and being a little bit less consistent as the game progresses. Now, even with 7 energies, what I found is, as I mentioned, you only really want to play 1 to 2 Beast Rings a game. So I usually am able to maintain about 4 to 5 energies in my deck by the turn I play Beast Ring, because in the early stages of the game, you're kind of aiming to put down your Strongs and your Beast energies, kind of spread those around your board, or even attach one of your basic fightings in conjunction with a strong energy to maybe put pressure on your opponent's board to attack into your Buzzwole. And as such, you're usually able to maintain a healthy amount of basic fightings in your deck, since you're able to always be playing these shuffle draw supporters and keeping the card counts in your deck that you want to keep high. You're able to keep them high just kind of by playing well. So as such, I never really found issues with not having the fighting energies in my deck, even though I'm running this lower count. So that's kind of the list. I was really proud of this. I put a lot of testing into it. And interestingly enough, actually, I made this deck with my teammate Alex Szymanski about a month before the event, which actually gave me a lot of time to really test it and figure out those last 2 cards. I was actually, the day I sat down to make this deck, I was about 2 cards off of where this is now. So it really helped to put in that extra time of testing to find those last two or three perfect spots to make the list as well as I possibly could. Now I'm going to run through some of my matchups across the tournament. On day 1, my round 1 opponent was a Zoroark Garbodor. That set ended up going 3 games. I lost one game just due to only finding one B-string and then having that Buzzwole get knocked out. It was just kind of unfortunate, but I was able to win the other 2 pretty easily. Matchup I felt was pretty strong because I've got Garbotoxin to turn off their trait abilities, and I've got this big baby Buzzwole, which can one-shot both Garbodor and Zoroark. Not much really to say there, just from what I felt, a pretty positive matchup that went pretty smoothly. My round 2, I played against a Gourgeist, which happens to be a very difficult matchup for me. I ended up losing in 3 games, and unfortunately they just kind of drew the cards they needed off end of 1 with Garbotoxin out, and there's just not much I can do about that. But it's definitely just a very hard matchup for me, so I was happy to even take it 2-3 games. I just don't have really many attackers that can one-shot Gourgeist easily, unless I'm using Knuckle Impact to take 1 prize and say I can't attack next turn. So it was just very much an uphill battle, especially given that they can one-shot me so easily. My next round, I played against a Zoroark Lycanroc, and they really had a hard time in this matchup. It's a very positive matchup for me. As I mentioned, Zoroark decks have a very hard time with the baby Buzzwole, and especially Garbotoxin turning off their trait abilities. One of the things going into this tournament is that I kind of predicted that most Zoroark decks would be going down to 2 Field Blowers, just because Garbodor decks were kind of fading back in terms of relevancy. We really saw a large step back of Garbotoxin because most Buzzwole decks are able to really outspeed the Garbotoxin decks now, but since I'm already running my own Buzzwoles, it's not as much of an issue because I already kind of I'm fighting fire with fire while also having the Garbotoxin. But in general, you saw the lower kind of Field Blowers in the Zoroark decks, so the Zoroark Lycanroc was a pretty quick and easy 2-0 for myself. There just wasn't much you could do once I set up a Garbotoxin and began attacking with Buzzwole. My next round, in round 4, was the first of many Buzzwole Lycanrocs that I would play against. This set ended up going 3 games. I drew pretty suboptimally, but I was able to come away with the win. In Game 3, I actually fell back 6-1, but on the back of an N-1 plus a Fury Belted Buzzwole, I was able to make a 6-1 comeback, which was pretty awesome. I was feeling really good coming out of that, just because 6-1 comebacks don't happen all the time in Standard right now. So next up, I played against yet another Buzzwole Lycanroc, and this time things went much smoother. It was a pretty quick and easy 2-0. I found my B-strings, got Garbodor set up, and there just wasn't much you could do. And then my next round was when things started to get interesting for me. I played against another Buzzwole Lycanroc, but this time it was the version that ran 3 of the baby Buzzwoles, and it was actually one of the big name players in the game right now. I played against Michael Pramalot, and we ended up going 3 games and tying. In Game 1, I kind of set up my strategy. There wasn't much he could do. He struggled to find his Lycanroc, which was kind of where he was trying to put his game plan the whole time, but because their list only plays one of the Lycanrocs, it was very difficult for him to find it once I got Garbotoxin out. And then in Game 2, I actually unfortunately did not set up Garbotoxin until almost the very end of the game. I believe on the second to last turn I set up Garbotoxin and played N, but he ended up top decking a Guzma out of it. So there's not really much I could do. I just kind of set up pretty slowly that game and unfortunately lost that one. And then Game 3 we just did not have enough time to really develop our game to any point of anything. We were both, I believe, still pretty high on prizes when time got called, so we ended up just tying. My round 8, I ended up playing against a Hoopa deck, and that matchup happens to be one of the, maybe my best matchup possible, because I've got Garbotoxin that turns off the Hoopa's ability, so Jet Punch is just an easy one-shot on Hoopas, and Sledgehammer is also an easy one-shot on Hoopas and other techs. So it was just a very uphill battle for him, and I won that one in a pretty quick 2-0. And then on my round 9, I played against a 4th Buzzwole Lycanroc, and this time it was not the Triple Baby Buzzwole version, it was just a pretty standard list. I set up pretty smoothly, got out my B-strings, and he did not draw his, so I ended up winning that one 2-0, and ended up making day 2 at 7-1-1. I was feeling really good coming into day 2. The meta was kind of almost exactly as I predicted. I predicted a lot of Buzzwole Lycanroc, but I was kind of interested to see that I put against 0 Malamar decks, which I did not predict to happen. I thought I would play against at least a couple, but I was not upset to not play against those. So going into day 2, I saw the metagame for day 2 was pretty favorable for me. There wasn't too much that was out there that was bad matchups, so I was just pretty ready. And then in my round 1 of day 2, I put against Sam Chen, who was playing, yet again, the 3 baby Buzzwole version of Buzzwole Lycanroc. And this time I ended up winning the matchup as opposed to tying like I did against Pram on day 1. It was pretty quick. Sam just didn't draw very well. He kind of bricked one of the games, and the other game I just went off with B-strings and Garbotoxin, and there just was not much he could do. So that one was a pretty quick 2-0, just not much he could really do against me. Nothing much to say there. And then in my round 2, I played against Jimmy Pendarvis, who was also playing the 3 baby Buzzwole version of Buzzwole Lycanroc. That one did not go as hot for me. With game 1, myself, I did not set up Garbodor. My Trubbish ended up getting killed on my turn 2, so I never got to evolve it, and it just went downhill from there. Garbodor is an extremely important component of the Buzzwole Lycanroc matchup, and usually you're able to put enough pressure on them with Buzzwole to force them to kill your Buzzwoles, but if you go second and only lay down one Trubbish, things can get a little dicey if they draw what they need to kill that Trubbish on their turn 2. So it was just kind of unfortunate. It happens sometimes, and in game 2, things went better for me. I went first, set up my Garbodor, got my B-strings, and there just wasn't much you could do. But then in game 3, it was my first game of the tournament where I totally dead drew. I, on my first turn, played like a Cynthia, I believe, got down my 2 Trubbishes, was feeling pretty good. But then on my next turn, I played 2 different order pads, got tails on both of them, and just had a totally dead hand. Ended up draw passing for a while, and eventually just lost. And that's kind of unfortunate, but it happens sometimes, so I kept going into the next round, still feeling pretty confident. I ended up playing against another Zoroark Lycanroc that matchup in my round 3. It was against Ryan Morgan, and there's just not much Ryan could do in that matchup. Like I mentioned, Garbodor and Buzzwole are just so strong against Zoroark decks. There's just not much they could do once I shut down their abilities and start hitting them for weakness and knocking out everything very quickly. It ended up being a pretty quick 2-0 for myself, and then I was just in a spot where I really had to win 1 or 2 more matches to make it into top cut, given that I was able to ID at least one of them. I had a chance to be on the bubble. Sorry about that, I lost my connection. My next matchup I ended up playing against Michael Pramalot yet again, but this time it was on stream. So it was a pretty tight match. My game 1, I ended up pulling it out, got the cards I needed when I needed them. Things ended up going pretty well. But then in game 2, I ended up not drawing as well. I only saw 1 B-string and didn't draw another energy with it. So I was kind of forced into a situation where I had to B-string to my baby Buzzwole. And usually when you do that, things aren't going so well. But I ended up taking it pretty close, and he ended up top decking one of his 2 Floatstones off of a low N, and I ended up losing that game too. So in game 3, things got pretty close, and I ended up going to time, and I had game on board, but unfortunately I was just out of time, out of turns, so I ended up tying that match. Going into the last round, I was on a potential win it in, but I didn't know I was at a record that could bubble out or it could make it, and I played against a Lapras deck. Ended up playing on stream again, and I ended up actually 2-0ing the Lapras player. From what I didn't really know what to expect going in, but kind of what I learned as the matchup went on was that I've got a lot of time to find my B-strings because I've got the Fighting Fury belts in my deck, which make it so that Buzzwole can't be one-shot by Lapras, and as such, the matchup's pretty easy for myself, especially given that I've got Garbotoxin to slow him down and turn off his abilities. So I ended up winning that matchup on a 2-0 victory. Unfortunately, I didn't end up doing as well as I'd hoped with the standings. I ended up bubbling out of the top 8 at, I believe it was 10-2 was my record. It was pretty sad because I felt like I kind of fought hard for it, but that's just kind of how resistance goes. Sometimes your opponents don't do so well and you miss out. So I ended up making top 16 with the deck, which I still felt was a very strong finish for the big regional, and kind of given that I really play against mostly strong matchups throughout the tournament. My friend Ian Robb played a version of this list that he had decided to change. He changed a couple cards, ended up making top 4, and my dad, actually, Phil Hollenberg, ended up making top 64 with the deck. So there were only 3 of us that played it, so I would consider that pretty strong in terms of results. I thought the deck performed very well for me, really consistent. I only had 1 game the entire tournament where I truly dead drew. So I'm really a large fan of this deck moving forward in the standard format. I think it is favorable against the baby Buzzwole version of Buzzwole Lycanroc. I think it's just with the combination of Garbotoxin and the Fury Belts and kind of just some smart play, you can usually get past those extra baby Buzzwoles as long as you draw what you need when you need it. But because of how this list is built, usually that's not an issue. As I mentioned, my friend Ian Robb, he decided to change 2 cards from the list that I sent him. He, instead of playing Random Receiver and Hala, was playing Choice Band and Professor Sycamore. And I do think one of those changes moving forward is correct, and the other one I think is actually incorrect. I think that Random Receiver was an extremely strong card in my deck. It allowed me to really be a lot more consistent with the deck. It allowed me to find kind of more supporters when I needed them. There were a couple times actually that I was able to either Random Receiver out of dead hands or Random Receiver into Guzmas to help myself win games. So I think Random Receiver is an extremely strong aspect of the deck. It really does help boost your consistency. But on the other hand, I do think Professor Sycamore is better than Hala. In theory, as I mentioned, Hala allows you to really help with the idea of conserving resources, But what I found is most of the time when I was playing my Hala in the late game, I would rather have played Professor Sycamore because my resources that I would have discarded actually were not too important. I would have usually been pitching things like my Beast Rings or my Search cards where I just couldn't really play them anymore. So it would have kind of been more useful to use the Hala as a Sycamore and thin my deck. So moving forward, I think Professor Sycamore is the correct choice in that spot, but that would be the only change I would make to this list. Overall, I was very pleased with my performance, very pleased with the deck, and I think it's got strong legs moving forward in Standard. As I mentioned, I think it's favorable against the Triple Buzzwole Lycanroc, and I also think it's favored against the other decks in Standard right now. It felt in my testing about even against the Ultra Necrozma Malamar decks, and even-ish, maybe a little bit unfavored against the Ultra Necrozma, or against the Malamar and Necrozma GX decks. And then against Zoroark decks, as I mentioned, it is heavily favored. So overall, I think it's got a strong matchup spread right now in Standard, and that's about it. Remember to use the coupon code TCCTEAM10 for 10% off your order from Top Cut Comics. I will see you all next time.